In the archive, history sleeps in silence. Then I found a reel that wasn't supposed to exist. It vanished overnight, erased, as if it had never been there.
The Lost Monastery, a report in 16 reels written from the bench where I learned to listen to light. Reel 1. Vault temperature. In the cold vault, time has a smell. Not the romantic kind people imagine when they say old film. Not incense, not dust, not nostalgia arranged like a still life. It's chemistry. A faint sweetness from polyester stock that refuses to age gracefully because it barely ages at all. A sharper, sour note when acetate begins to give up and announce itself as vinegar syndrome. The clean metallic edge from cans that have been opened and shut by hands that never meet the people whose faces live inside the reels. I've spent most of my adult life learning that smell the way monks learn a chant. Repetition until it becomes part of the body. I can tell the difference between a print that needs air and a print that needs isolation. Between harmless must and a decomposition that, if ignored, will turn image into lace. I know how to hold the edge of a 35mm strip without touching the emulsion, how to listen for the tiny complaint a splice makes when it meets tension, how to read shrinkage from the way perforations sit, obedient, then stubborn, then off-register like a child refusing instruction. At UCLA, I'm paid to be a custodian of what most people call entertainment and what I've always considered a form of thinking. The work on paper is orderly. Intake, inspection, cataloging, storage, access, preservation. Sometimes restoration, though that word is used too loosely. You can't restore what was never stable. You can only decide what kind of loss you're willing to accept. Most days, I can pretend that the vault is a library with unusually temperamental books. I can pretend that the drama is limited to budgets, schedules, the slow negotiations between curators who want to show everything and conservators who want to touch nothing. I can pretend. On the morning I found the Lost Monastery, I was in the middle of a mundane review. A batch of educational shorts from the mid-century era when American institutions thought film could teach almost anything if the narrator sounded certain enough. A civics reel about zoning, a safety film where a man in a clean suit demonstrates how not to lose fingers to a lathe, a color film strip about the wonders of dairy. Ephemera, yes. Yet these were the films that told the truth of their time without intending to. You don't look at them for plot. You look at them the way you look at a street in the background of a home movie. The cars, the signage, the posture of strangers, evidence living in the margins. I pulled a cart between aisles, checking call numbers against the database, replacing what had been misshelved by hurried hands. The vault is not romantic, it's industrial order. Steel racks, barcodes, humidity logs, notes in pencil that survive longer than ink. Each shelf is a promise that what is stored here will outlive the people who stored it. Then my hand landed on a can that didn't belong. Not just wrong section wrong, not misfiled by a digit wrong. It sat among 16mm educational reels like a stone in a loaf of bread. A 35mm canister, heavier, older, its metal dulled in a way that suggested it had traveled through decades without acquiring the standardized stickers and institutional handwriting that most objects collect in a place like ours. On the lid, someone had written in a firm, almost formal script, "The Lost Monastery, no accession number, no donor name, no pencil scrawl telling me whether it was a print, an interpositive, a dupe negative. Just the title, and beneath it a second line in Greek characters I could not immediately pass. For a moment, I stood holding it against my chest, feeling the cold transfer through my shirt as if the can were trying to lower my temperature to match its own. In archives, curiosity is not a virtue. Curiosity is how you end up projecting something that should never see a lamp. Curiosity is how you scratch an emulsion, misthread a reel, break a perforation, and turn a unique object into a cautionary story. We are trained to distrust the impulse to just see. But the title had the particular effect that some titles have. It didn't sound like a film, it sounded like a rumor. I signed it out under a temporary handling slip. My name, date, time, the kind of bureaucratic ritual that makes transgression look like procedure, and rolled it to my inspection bench. I told myself I would only open it to identify its contents for proper storage. I told myself I would do what I always do: examine leaders, read edge codes, check base, measure shrinkage, smell for vinegar, look for mold. I told myself I would behave like the kind of person the vault expects me to be. Then I unlatched the lid. Inside was a reel on a core, already unusual because cores imply a certain kind of archival handling, whereas prints that have been shown tend to live on reels with flanges. The film was wound evenly, not too tight, not too loose. The leader was long and clean, no lab markings I recognized, no standard picture start countdown. Instead, at the head of the leader, a strip of paper tape had been affixed, and on it, in that same calm hand, were words in English: "Do not duplicate. Do not project." Underneath, in smaller writing, "If you are reading this, you have already begun." It was not a threat. It was not a joke. It read like a note someone leaves in a book for the next reader, who will one day be the only person alive who knows the book exists. I sat down. Above my bench, the fluorescent lights hummed with their usual institutional boredom. My fingers hovered at the edge of the leader. I did what I always do when a reel makes my instincts flare. I slowed down until I could hear each small sound, film whispering through gloves I wasn't wearing. We don't use gloves unless necessary. Gloves make you clumsy. The dry click of the rewinds, the faint static pop of acetate against air. I began to spool. Reel 2, 10 minutes of light. There is a kind of first image that declares itself as cinema immediately, even without sound. Not because it's beautiful, but because it carries intention. The first frames of the Lost Monastery were black. Not leader black, image black with grain. The black was alive, textured like velvet seen too close. Then a pale form emerged, not as a cut, but as if the darkness were being thinned. A cliff. No, more precisely, a wall of stone rising so steeply it seemed to refuse the horizon. The camera was looking upward. Above the stone, clouds moved with the slow, indifferent drift of weather that has never heard of human schedules. Then, as if the camera operator had been floating, the frame tilted and the top of a structure came into view. Not a castle, not a fort, but something with the geometry of devotion. A monastery perched where logic would prefer emptiness. The image had a clarity that didn't match its supposed age. It was monochrome, but not in the flat way of many early prints. The whites were not blown. The shadows did not collapse. The tonal range felt, this is the only honest word, designed. I leaned closer to the viewer, feeling absurdly like someone approaching a painting to see the brushwork. There were no intertitles, no credits, no establishing text to tell me where or when. The camera drifted along the cliff face, and I watched, startled, as it moved with a steadiness that suggested equipment far more modern than the canister implied. Not handheld wobble, not the rigid immobility of a tripod. Something else, a glide that felt like breath. A figure entered the frame, first just a dark shape against stone, then a man, robed, moving up a narrow path carved into the cliff. His gait was neither hurried nor ceremonial. He walked as if walking were an agreement between his body and gravity. The camera followed him, but it followed not like an observer. It followed like a companion. I have watched thousands of reels. I have spent long weeks looking at the smallest differences between prints, comparing contrast, catching the moment a frame line jumps because a splice was made carelessly decades ago, noting the tremor that indicates a worn printer gate. My eyes are trained to look for damage. And yet within minutes I realized I was no longer looking for damage. The film did something subtle and deeply unsettling. It made me forget to monitor it. A second figure appeared. A younger monk, perhaps, though age is difficult in monochrome. He stepped out from a doorway cut into stone and looked directly at the camera. Not as performers sometimes do when they accidentally break the illusion. Not as a documentary subject might do when aware of being filmed. He looked at the lens with recognition, as if he were looking at someone he had been expecting. Then he turned, and the camera followed him into shadow. Inside, the light changed. It was not the typical shift you see when a camera moves from exterior to interior, those blown windows, those muddy blacks. Here, the exposure held, or seemed to, as if the film stock itself had been tuned to stone and candle. I saw an interior corridor lined with icons, faces rendered in that Byzantine way, stylized but intimate, eyes large not for sentiment but for vigilance. The camera moved past them slowly, and the icons seemed to watch the camera, and therefore to watch me. A sound came through the inspection viewer's tiny speaker, and I startled because I hadn't expected sound at all. It wasn't dialogue, it wasn't music. It was the low roar of something mechanical, a steady fluttering that sounded like wind through reeds, or like a projector in another room. Under it, faintly, a chant, not words so much as vowel shapes held and released. I glanced down at the edge of the film and saw an optical track. Of course, there was sound. I simply hadn't noticed. My mind had been too busy accepting the images as if they had always had the right to exist. In the corridor, the monk stopped before a door. He placed his hand on it. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I felt, inexplicably, addressed. Then he opened the door. Inside was a room that made my stomach tighten, not from horror, not from any obvious threat, but from the shock of the unfamiliar made precise. The room was filled with film, not neatly shelved cans, not reels in cases. Film hung like cloth from wooden beams, strips draped and drying as if the monastery were a laboratory and the monks were developing more than photographs. There were glass plates on a table. There were jars that caught candlelight and returned it in fragments. There was, at the far end of the room, a structure that looked like a camera, though it was too large, too ornate, too old. The monk walked toward it, and the camera followed. When he reached the structure, he turned again to the lens, and his mouth formed a word I could not hear, but I saw it clearly, my name. I did not think he said my name. I saw the shape of it, the way lips shape syllables, and my body reacted before my mind could offer skepticism. My hands tightened on the rewinds. The film tugged slightly, and I loosened, breath held, not wanting to tear anything, not wanting to disturb whatever agreement I had accidentally entered. At minute 10, because later I checked the time code on my handling log, and it was almost exactly 10 minutes, the overhead lights blinked once, twice. Then the bench viewer went dark. The fluorescent hum died. The vault, usually a place where even silence feels regulated, became suddenly and completely without power. Emergency lighting kicked in along the floor, dim, bluish, more like moonlight than safety. The inspection bench, my island of controlled examination, was now a shadowed desk with a half-spooled reel of unknown origin sitting open to air. In the dim, the film looked less like a record and more like a skin. I sat still for longer than I can justify, hands hovering near the reel, as if I were afraid it might move on its own. When I finally stood, I did not rewind the film through the viewer again. I did not continue. I did what a responsible archivist does when conditions become unsafe. I rewound slowly by hand, keeping tension minimal, feeling each turn as if I were returning something to sleep. I sealed the canister. I wrote a quick note for myself, too quick, the handwriting cramped, the words inadequate, and locked the can in a temporary secure cabinet rather than returning it to the shelves. Power outages mean doors malfunction, alarms misbehave. People are suddenly everywhere, doing what they can with flashlights and radios. I told myself, tomorrow, when everything is stable, I will watch again. I will verify what I saw. And because I have always believed that objects in archives remain where you put them, because that belief is the foundation of our entire profession, I left for the night with the calm of someone who assumes the world will continue to follow rules. Reel 3. The missing can. The next day the lights were back, the servers humming, the vault's temperature graphs returning to their steady lines. A power outage in Los Angeles is not apocalypse. It's a reminder that the city's brightness is borrowed. I came in early, earlier than I ever need to. The kind of early that makes the building feel unfinished, as if the architecture expects more people to justify its existence. I went straight to the secure cabinet. The cabinet was unlocked, and not broken, not forced, simply unlocked. The shelf where I had placed the canister was empty. For a few seconds I did not react. My mind ran through the ordinary explanations first, as it always does. A colleague moved it for safety. Facilities checked the cabinet. Security protocol required relocation. My rationality, trained by decades of preventing panic, presented a menu of plausible scenarios. Then I saw my handling slip still clipped to the cabinet's inside door. My name, the date, the time, and no signature indicating transfer. The absence became physical, a weight in my chest, not fear exactly, but the sensation of having stepped onto a stair that is not there. I checked the surrounding shelves, the adjacent cabinets, the intake area, the cart I had used the day before. I did not find so much as the dull metal lid. I walked to the front desk and asked, carefully, casually, the way you ask about a missing object in a place where people take missing objects personally. No one had seen it. No one had touched my cabinet. The security logs showed no forced entry, no alarms, nothing that indicated an object had been removed, because for the system to notice, the object would have had to exist in the system. And it didn't. I returned to my desk and opened the database, typing in the title even though I already knew it would yield nothing. The Lost Monastery. No matches. I searched variations, Greek transliterations I could guess. Monastery alone. Lost alone. Nothing. I tried to laugh at myself, as if this were an elaborate prank staged by the universe to remind me that I am not the protagonist of anything. Then the memory of that monk shaping my name came back with such sharpness that I felt briefly nauseated. I pulled up a list of all 35mm holdings in the section where I had found it. There should have been an empty slot, an inconsistency, a barcode that suddenly didn't match its neighbor. But the shelves were, by institutional logic, perfect. I went back to the aisle and stood where I had found the can the day before. I stared at the space, half expecting the metal circle to reappear like a conjured object. I did not say the title out loud. Titles have power in archives, not mystical power, but administrative power. Saying a title means acknowledging its place in a chain of custody. Saying it means beginning paperwork. It means involving others. It means inviting the large, slow machinery of institutional response. But I also knew something else. If I didn't involve others, the film would become my private hallucination, a professional embarrassment I would carry like an undeveloped negative in my pocket until it turned useless. I called one person I trusted to treat my alarm as serious without turning it into gossip. Her name is Mara. Mara makes documentaries the way some people make confessions, with structure, with restraint, with an insistence that the camera is not neutral but can still be honest. We met years ago when she came to the archive looking for footage of migrant labor movements in California. I watched her sit with a Steenbeck for hours, rewinding the same few seconds of a worker's face until she understood what she needed. She didn't treat the footage as raw material. She treated it as testimony. We have stayed friends in that odd way friendships endure between people who spend their lives around recorded time. We understand each other's fixations without needing to flatter them. When she answered, I didn't begin with the film. I began with the power outage. Then I told her the title. There was a pause on the line. I'm coming, she said. Not, are you sure? Not, maybe you misread. Just, I'm coming. For the first time since the cabinet door swung open onto emptiness, I felt a small, fierce relief. Because if the film had decided to disappear, it would now have to contend with Mara's stubbornness. Reel 4, the documentarian's rule. Mara arrived with a backpack that looked too small to hold what she always carries. A camera, spare batteries, 2 microphones, a notebook, a pencil, a tiny flashlight, and the kind of patience that can outlast bureaucracy. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything again, this time with more detail. The canister, the handwritten warning, the room filled with film, the monk forming my name. When I finished, she didn't immediately speak. She looked past me at the shelves, at the vault door, at the everyday architecture of preservation. Then she said, "Show me where you found it." I led her to the aisle. I pointed at the section. She crouched, scanning the shelf edges as if she expected to see a scratch, a displaced dust pattern, anything that would suggest physical reality. "What's the protocol?" she asked. "There isn't one," I said. "Not for a film that isn't in the database." "There's always a protocol," she said. "It's just not written for the thing you're facing." She stood. "Let's treat it like an investigation." I almost laughed, but the word investigation landed with unexpected accuracy. In archives, provenance is everything. A film without provenance is not a treasure. It's a problem. It could be stolen. It could be mislabeled. It could be an ethical trap. It could be a legal trap. It could be a reel of someone's private life that never consented to institutional possession. But this film wasn't simply unknown. It had arrived in the vault like an object placed intentionally into the path of someone trained to notice anomalies. Mara pulled out her notebook. "Start with what you have," she said. "What I have is a memory." "A memory is data," she said. "Not perfect, but usable." So I listed what I could recall with the precision of an inspection report. Gauge, 35 millimeters. Sound, optical track, low mechanical flutter, faint chant. Stock, uncertain, but the base didn't curl like nitrate. It lay with the mild obedience of acetate or polyester. Leader, unusually long, no standard countdown. Label, title in English, second line in Greek script. Warning, do not duplicate, do not project. If you are reading this, you have already begun. Mara wrote it down as if it were a witness statement. "What about the Greek?" she asked. "I didn't translate it," I admitted. "I should have photographed it. I didn't." Mara's eyes narrowed, not in accusation, but in that filmmaker's way of seeing a missed shot as both tragedy and motivation. "Then we reconstruct," she said. "How?" "We find anyone who might recognize the handwriting," she said. "We find any record of a can like that entering the building. We find the absence." She paused. "And you said the film said your name." I began, then stopped. The truth was too strange to state cleanly. The monk's lips formed my name. Mara didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's made for you." The idea made my skin prickle. "I don't believe in destiny," I said, because I needed to say something that sounded like adulthood. Mara smiled slightly. "Neither do I," she said, "but I believe in intention." That afternoon, we did the unglamorous work that every mystery depends on. Paperwork, emails, phone calls, and careful questions asked of people who have learned to distrust drama. We searched security camera footage. We found the power outage recorded as a time-stamped glitch, a blank interval where the cameras, too, had gone dark. After power returned, the footage resumed. There was no image of anyone opening my cabinet, no image of anyone carrying a canister. Mara's voice stayed calm. "We're looking in the wrong place," she said. "Where should we look?" I asked. "In the film's chain," she said. "It doesn't matter how it left, it matters how it arrived." So we went deeper into the archive's memory, the old accession logs, the donor files, the paper records that predated the database. We pulled boxes labeled with years. We opened folders that smelled of cardboard and dust rather than acetate. We read typed forms where someone had once described a film with a few dry words, and then moved on to the next task, unaware that decades later their ink would become a clue. We found nothing under the title. Then, near the end of a box from the early 1970s, I found a yellowed sheet folded inside another folder, as if someone had hidden it in plain sight. On it, in a typewriter font that had worn slightly uneven, were 3 lines. Item received, 35 millimeters, 2 reels, sound. Working title, Monastery, Lost. Donor, Callistratos D, Classics Department. And beneath those lines, handwritten in pencil, faint as if the person writing hadn't wanted to commit fully to the act, hold, do not circulate. Refer to Athens correspondence. Mara exhaled softly. "That's your entry," she said. The name Callistratos struck me not as familiar, but as plausible. UCLA's Classics Department had long been populated by scholars whose offices were full of artifacts that should have belonged to museums. Film canisters compared to ancient pottery were almost modest. "Who was he?" Mara asked. I shook my head. "Before my time." "But not before the archive's time," she said. We requested personnel directories. We searched university archives. We found a retired faculty listing. Demetrios Kallistratos, professor of Byzantine history, known for fieldwork in Greece and for an obsession with monastic libraries. He had died in 1989. His papers, if they existed, might be in special collections, or in a family home, or lost, or, like so many scholars' legacies, boxed and forgotten until someone with a grant found a reason to care. Mara tapped her pencil against the yellowed sheet. "Athens correspondence," she repeated. "That's not a metaphor." And for the first time since the reel vanished, the story acquired what investigations need most: a direction. Reel 5, paper trails and silver halide. If you've never handled an archive's paper files, you might imagine them as neat histories waiting to be discovered. They are not. They are the sediment of decisions. What someone thought mattered, what someone didn't have time to record, what someone assumed would be obvious later. They are full of abbreviations that only made sense to the person who wrote them. They contain contradictions because institutions, like people, change their minds without annotating the change. We found a folder marked Kallistratos in a drawer reserved for restricted donor agreements. Inside were copies of letters written on thin airmail paper, the kind that becomes translucent with age. The letters were between Kallistratos and an institution in Athens, an archive, perhaps, or a monastery administrator. The Greek was handwritten, elegant, dense. Mara photographed each page. I scanned for English words, for names, for anything I could recognize. One phrase repeated, monastery. Another, film in Greek phonetics. Another, archion photos, which I later learned translates roughly as archive of light. There was one letter, dated 1971, from Athens to Kallistratos. The header bore a stamp I couldn't identify, but beneath it, a sentence in English, likely added for clarity: "This object is not to be copied. It is to be kept in darkness except when studied." Mara looked up from her camera. "That's almost your warning," she said. I held the paper carefully, feeling the odd intimacy of touching the same fibers Kallistratos had touched half a century earlier. "Why would an archive in Athens send a film to a professor in Los Angeles?" Mara asked. "Maybe they didn't," I said. "Maybe he acquired it." "Acquired?" she repeated, letting the word carry its moral ambiguity. "Or removed." I didn't want to believe in theft. Archivists are trained to treat objects as responsibilities, not trophies. But I have also learned that scholars, especially those who imagine themselves as rescuers, sometimes justify private possession as preservation. We dug further. We found a note from 1973. Print returned, unclear. Another, reels separated, one in vault, one, oh. The second reel was not mentioned again. 2 reels, Mara said softly. "You only saw one canister." I stared at the paper. The story was widening. The film I had handled might have been only half of what existed. "Or," Mara said, reading my face, "the other reel is the reason this one disappears." We spent the next week contacting anyone connected to Kallistratos. Departmental administrators, retired faculty, librarians. Most emails returned with polite confusion or silence. A few people remembered him as brilliant, difficult, the kind of scholar who treated students as footnotes unless they proved themselves in Greek. Finally, a librarian in special collections replied with a small, crucial fact. Kallistratos had donated some papers to UCLA before his death, but the donation was incomplete. The rest, according to a brief note, had been taken by his niece and moved back to Greece. Mara read the email twice. "Do we have a name for the niece?" The librarian provided it, Eleni Kallistratou, and an address in Athens recorded decades earlier. The investigation, which had begun in the cold air of a UCLA vault, now had an inevitable next frame: travel. I should have hesitated. I should have considered budgets, permissions, institutional protocol. I should have remembered that archivists are not adventurers. We are supposed to keep the world from moving too quickly. But something else had taken hold. something that felt less like obsession and more like responsibility. If the film existed, and if it could vanish from a secure cabinet without leaving a trace, then it was not only a curiosity, it was a test of what preservation meant when the object resisted custody. Mara didn't ask if I wanted to go. She asked, "When can you leave?" Reel 6. Athens First Cut. Athens in late summer is a city of sun that doesn't apologize. The air vibrates with heat and traffic and the particular exhaustion of old stone surrounded by modern impatience. I had been to Greece once as a graduate student, an academic pilgrimage to ruins, notebooks full of sketches and quotes. That trip had been about the past as object. This trip was about the past as fugitive. Mara and I rented a small apartment near Exarchia, a neighborhood with walls that speak in layers of graffiti and political posters. At night, the city sounded like conversation. Voices, scooters, distant music. In Los Angeles, night is often private. In Athens, it felt communal, as if even insomnia belonged to the street. We went first to the institution whose stamp appeared on the letters, a building tucked behind newer facades. The sign outside was modest. A film archive, partially government-funded, partially surviving on love and stubbornness. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled familiarly of paper and adhesive. An archivist named Sophia greeted us, sharp-eyed, polite, carrying the exhaustion of someone who keeps cultural memory alive with insufficient resources. When I explained carefully who I was and what we were looking for, her expression changed, not disbelief, recognition. "You are not the first to ask," she said. Mara lifted her camera slightly, but Sophia held up a hand. "No filming," she said, not unkindly. "Not yet." She led us into a small office lined with filing cabinets older than I was. She pulled out a ledger bound in cracked leather, opened it to a page, and pointed. There in Greek was an entry dated 1968, Monetes Apoleias, Monastery of Loss. Beside it, 2 reels, sound, origin uncertain, restricted, and in the margin a note. Callistratos insists for study abroad, conditional. My throat tightened. The film was not a ghost. It was a documented object, controversial even then. "Where is it now?" I asked. Sophia's mouth tightened into something between resignation and irritation. "Not here," she said. "It was removed from our holdings during the junta years. Things disappeared. Some returned. This did not." "Do you know who took it?" Mara asked. Sophia looked at her, then at me. "There are stories," she said. "Collectors, foreign scholars, officials, monks, all claiming they were saving it." She closed the ledger. "But I can tell you this. That title is not a title." "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "A translation. The original name is older. It is not Greek exactly. It is Byzantine Greek, liturgical." Mara's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Sophia's fingers traced the leather spine of the ledger as if grounding herself. "Meaning it might not be a film made as film," she said. "It might be something made as relic. My profession trains me to resist such language. Relics belong to religion, not archives. But then again, archives are not as secular as we pretend. We treat objects with rituals. We build climate-controlled sanctuaries. We prohibit touch. We assign priests, curators, conservators, archivists to mediate access." "What do you know about its origin?" I asked. Sophia leaned back. "There are rumors it was shot near Meteora," she said, "or on Athos, or both. There are rumors a German cameraman made it during the occupation. There are rumors monks made it with help from someone who understood emulsion." She met my eyes. "And there are rumors that every time someone tries to copy it, the copy is blank." Mara's hand went still on her notebook. "That's convenient myth," she said. Sophia shrugged. "Myths form when facts are dangerous," she said. "Dangerous to whom?" I asked. Sophia looked toward the window, where Athens moved on without caring about our conversation. "To the idea that history is stable," she said. "To the idea that film is only representation." Her words landed in me like a splice that doesn't quite align. I thought of the monk's mouth forming my name. I thought of my own calm assumption that the vault's order was a kind of law. "Where do we go next?" Mara asked. Sophia opened a drawer and handed me a photocopy. It was a letter, faint, from Callistratos to a monastery administrator. The address at the top was not Athens. It was Thessaloniki. And beneath it, one line in English, written in Callistratos' meticulous hand: "If the archive refuses, the monastery will remember." Reel 7, Thessaloniki, second reel. Thessaloniki has a different rhythm than Athens. Less mythic in the tourist imagination, more lived in, a port city with a history of invasions and trade and layered religions. The sea smells like metal and salt and the faint sweetness of street food. We came because of the letter. We found the address, an old building now occupied by offices and a small cultural foundation. The foundation director, a man named Petros, met us with the cautious hospitality of someone who has learned that foreigners arrive with requests, not offerings. When I showed him the photocopy, his eyebrows rose. "Callistratos," he said. "Yes, we have his name in our files." He led us down a hallway to a room that felt like a storeroom pretending to be a museum. There were posters from Greek films, Angelopoulos, Kakoyannis, faded but reverent. There were shelves of books. There were also in one corner film cans stacked like unclaimed luggage. Petros knelt, pulled one can forward, and wiped dust from the lid. On it, in Greek, were words I could now recognize. Montes Apoleas, Monastery of Los. My pulse quickened. "Is it?" I began. Petros held up a finger. "This is not the film," he said. "This is the can." He opened it carefully. Inside was not a reel. It was empty. Mara's laugh was short, not amused. "A decoy," she said. Petros nodded. "Or a placeholder," he said. "Callistratos left it with us in 1974. He said he would return for it. He never did." "Why keep an empty can?" I asked. Petros looked at me as if the answer were obvious. "Because it proves something existed," he said, "and because someone might come looking." He lifted the can's lid again and pointed to the inside. There, taped to the metal, was a small piece of paper folded into a tight square. He handed it to me. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, of a mountainous region, a rough outline of cliffs, a mark like a cross, a name written in Greek, Meteora, Meteora. Below it, a second note in English, second reel kept where stone becomes ladder. Mara leaned close. "Stone becomes ladder," she repeated. "Poetic or literal. In Meteora, stone becomes ladder. The monasteries there are built atop towering rock pillars once reached by rope ladders and nets. Places designed to make access difficult, not from cruelty, but from intention, separation as devotion." We thanked Petros. We left with the empty can and the map and the uneasy sense that the film was not merely lost. It had been placed and moved and hidden by people who understood both its fragility and its power. On the train toward the mountains, Mara finally spoke the question she had been holding. "Do you think someone at UCLA took it?" she asked. I stared out at the passing landscape, olive groves, low hills, distant stone. "I don't know," I said. "But it disappeared the day after you watched it." "Yes. And you watched 10 minutes." "Yes." Mara's voice lowered. "What if watching it is part of how it moves?" I wanted to dismiss her, but my mind returned to that warning on the leader. "If you are reading this, you have already begun." It had not said if you are watching, it had said reading, as if the film understood itself not as entertainment but as text, as if my act of looking had been an act of participation. Reel 8, Meteora, where stone becomes ladder. The first sight of Meteora feels like a visual effect, even when you're standing in it. The rock pillars rise from the plain like an argument against physics, massive, vertical, scarred by time. Monasteries cling to their tops like punctuation marks, small structures asserting meaning against an indifferent geology. We arrived in late afternoon. The air smelled of pine and dust. Tourists moved through the area with cameras and water bottles, their voices echoing between rock faces. It was difficult at first to reconcile this place's present, gift shops, parking lots, with its intended isolation. Mara filmed from a distance. She always prefers to begin with context, with the world outside the mystery. She captured tourists, signs, the way sunlight hit stone. Her camera turned everything into potential evidence. We had one clue, a crossmark on a map and the phrase, "where stone becomes ladder." We went to the monastery offices, asked politely about archives, about film holdings. Most monks and staff were cordial but puzzled. Film is not what most visitors ask about. They ask about icons, about history, about miracles, not about reels. At the third monastery, a younger monk named Ioannis listened to my explanation with an expression that shifted slowly from confusion to something closer to caution. "You said UCLA," he repeated. "Yes. And you said Callistratos?" "Yes." He glanced at Mara's camera and then away. "No filming," he said softly. Mara lowered the camera without protest. Ioannis led us not into a chapel, but into a small side room lined with cabinets. He unlocked one and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photographs, black and white, of a monastery interior, a room with film strips hanging like laundry. My stomach tightened. The room from the film, or a room like it. Ioannis watched my face. "You have seen," he said. It wasn't a question. I managed, "only a little." He nodded, as if that were dangerous enough. "The reel is not here," he said. "Not now." "Was it here?" Mara asked. Ioannis's gaze flicked to her, assessing. "Once," he said, "and then it was taken to Athos." My mind immediately supplied the complication. Mount Athos, the monastic peninsula that remains by tradition and law closed to women. Mara knew it too. I saw her jaw set. Ioannis continued, "It was not taken for theft. It was taken for safekeeping. There are things that should not be shown in places where tourists eat ice cream." "Why?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because the reel is not only images, it is a record of vows." "A record of vows?" Mara echoed. Ioannis's hands tightened on the folder. "I should not say more," he said, "but you will go to Athos if you truly seek it. And you," he looked at Mara, "will have to decide how to seek without entering." Mara's voice was steady. "I've been seeking things I'm not allowed into my whole career," she said. "That's documentary." Ioannis almost smiled, then stopped himself. He gave me a second piece of paper, a contact name, a phone number, and a word written carefully in Greek. Kibotos, Ark. "Ask for Ark," he said. "Not the film." Then he left us alone in the side room with the photographs, as if giving us time to understand that the story had crossed a threshold. We were no longer dealing with institutional secrecy. We were dealing with devotional secrecy, which is older and less negotiable. Outside, the sun lowered, casting long shadows across stone. The monasteries looked less like monuments and more like watchtowers. Mara stood beside me. "You're going to Athos," she said. "Yes." And I'm not. I didn't answer because the injustice of it was baked into the world long before either of us arrived. Mara turned her camera back on, not to film monks or interiors, but to film my hands holding the photographs. Her lens lingered on the image of the room with hanging film strips. "This," she said quietly, "is already impossible." "How?" I asked. She tapped the photo. "Because monks don't usually hang film like laundry," she said, "unless they're making it." Reel 9, the permit. You do not simply go to Mount Athos. You request entry. You wait. You accept rules that are older than the bureaucracies that now process them. I applied for the permit. I provided identification. I explained I was a scholar. I did not mention the film's warning. I did not mention that it had shaped my name on a monk's mouth like prophecy. Mara rented a car and mapped out what she could do outside the peninsula. Interviews with historians, visits to regional archives, filming landscapes, collecting context. We agreed, without needing to say it, that our separation would not be a pause but a split screen. The permit was granted with a date, a window of entry, a list of instructions that read in their formal tone like a script for humility. On the morning I left, Mara walked with me to the bus. She didn't hug me. She doesn't do sentimental gestures when the work is sharp. Remember, she said, if it's real, it's material. Material leaves traces. And if it's not? I asked. Mara looked at me for a long moment. Then it's still doing something, she said, and that something is the story. The bus carried me toward the peninsula. The landscape shifted, fields to hills to a coastline that looked briefly like an etching. At the port where pilgrims gather, men stood with bags, some with prayer ropes in their hands, some with cameras they would not be allowed to use everywhere, some with the distracted expressions of people who have chosen to step temporarily out of modern life. I felt for the first time self-conscious about my role. I wasn't coming to pray. I was coming to retrieve an object made of plastic and silver halide, an object that could be measured in feet and frames and degrees of shrinkage. And yet everyone I had spoken to treated it as if it were not merely an object, but a boundary marker between what can be shown and what must remain hidden. The boat ride to Athos was quiet. The sea moved with indifferent rhythm. The monasteries along the shore appeared gradually, built into cliffs like stubborn thoughts. They looked from a distance less like tourist sites and more like fortresses built to protect not people, but attention. At the entry point, an official checked permits. Names were recorded. There was a sense of being processed by a machine that pretends to be timeless. I carried a small bag with minimal belongings and, in my pocket, the folded map from Thessaloniki, like a talisman I didn't want to admit was a talisman. A monk met me with a truck. He did not introduce himself by name. He drove without speaking much. Pine trees passed. The road wound upward. Eventually we arrived at a monastery that looked in the late morning light almost gentle. Stone walls warmed by sun, courtyards with potted plants, a bell tower that suggested order. Inside, silence was not absence. It was a texture. The monk who received me was older, his beard grey, his eyes clear in a way that made me feel suddenly transparent. "You are the archivist," he said. "Not an archivist, the archivist." "My name is—" I began. He held up a hand. "Names are not important," he said. "You have already been named." My throat tightened. He led me through corridors that smelled of wax and stone. We passed icons, their faces calm, their gaze steady. I found myself thinking absurdly of close-ups in Dreyer, how a face can become landscape, how belief can be filmed as texture rather than statement. We reached a small room. On the table was a metal canister. My breath caught. The lid bore the same handwriting I had seen at UCLA, the Lost Monastery. The monk sat opposite me. "You watched," he said. "Yes," I admitted. "How long?" 10 minutes. He nodded, as if 10 minutes were a known threshold. "Do you know what film is?" he asked. The question, from a monk to an archivist, might have been insulting, but his tone carried no insult. It carried something like genuine inquiry, as if he meant, "Do you know what this thing truly does?" "I know what it's made of," I said carefully. "I know how it decays. I know how to preserve it." The monk's mouth curved slightly. "You know how to preserve the body," he said. "Do you know how to preserve the vow?" I did not answer because I did not understand. He placed his hand on the canister. "This reel has been moved many times," he said. "Not to hide it from the world, but to keep the world from using it wrongly." "Wrongly how?" I asked. The monk looked at me with a sadness that felt ancient. "By treating it as spectacle," he said. "By treating it as proof. By treating it as property." I leaned forward. "Then what is it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "It is an archive that remembers its viewers." The words should have sounded like metaphor, but I remembered the monk on the film shaping my name. "And the second reel?" I asked. The monk's eyes narrowed. "You know there is a second reel." "Yes." He tapped the canister once, gently. "This is the first," he said. "The second is not here." "Where is it?" He looked past me toward the room's small window, where light made a rectangle on stone. "In the place the film calls itself," he said. I waited. He finally said, The Lost Monastery is not only a location. He stood. Come, he said. He led me out of the room, down deeper corridors, into a section of the monastery that felt less maintained, more like storage. He unlocked a door. Inside was a room that stopped my breath. Film strips hung from beams, glass plates on a table, jars catching candlelight. And at the far end, there it was, the camera-like structure, ornate, too large, too old. It was not a prop. It was real. The monk's voice was quiet. "This is the Ark," he said. "This is the archive of light." I stepped forward slowly, as if approaching an animal that might bolt. On the table beside the structure was a strip of film, short, perhaps a foot long. It lay like a ribbon. The monk watched my hands. "Do not touch," he said. I didn't. "How old is this?" I asked. The monk answered without hesitation. "Older than your profession," he said. "Older than cinema." That was impossible, and yet the room existed. Mara's voice echoed in my memory. "If it's real, it's material. Material leaves traces. Here were traces." The monk continued. "The film you watched was made from this," he said. "But it is not an ordinary copy. It is a vow placed into emulsion." I felt dizzy, not from mysticism, but from the collision of two systems of belief. Mine, based on chemistry and cataloguing, his, based on devotion and secrecy. Both, in their way, were about resisting loss. "Why show it to me?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered. The monk's gaze sharpened. "Because it showed you first," he said. Then, in a gesture that felt like both invitation and warning, he opened a drawer beneath the table. Inside was an empty reel core, and taped to it, the second reel's leader, without the reel itself. On the leader, in that same handwriting, "You will bring it home." Below, "Home is where it is watched." My hands went cold. I looked up at the monk. "This is—" I began. He interrupted. "Not prophecy," he said. "Responsibility." Then he added almost gently, "The second reel is not lost, it is waiting." Reel 10, the intrigue inside the intrigue. That night I slept in a small guest cell with a wooden bed and a window that looked out onto darkness thick with trees. The monastery's sounds were minimal. Distant footsteps, a faint bell, the occasional murmur of prayer like someone speaking to themselves in a language older than worry. I should have been exhausted. Instead, my mind ran like a projector with the take-up reel missing, images spilling, tension building. The next day, the monk who had shown me the room, he finally offered his name. Father Arcadios, allowed me to examine the canister but not to open it. "You may look," he said, "not watch." I almost laughed at the distinction. Looking is watching, watching is looking. But I understood what he meant. The ritual of projection, the commitment of time, the surrender to sequence. That was what he wanted to prevent until certain conditions were met. I examined the lid. The handwriting was identical to what I had seen at UCLA. I examined the can's metal, older, with a patina that suggested it was not American manufacture. I looked for stamps, for any clue that would connect it to a lab. Father Arcadios watched me as if he were watching someone read an icon. "Tell me," he said, "what do you see?" I answered like an archivist. "Tin can, handwritten label, possibly mid-century, no accession marking, no lab stamp visible." He nodded. "And beyond that?" I hesitated. Then, because honesty is the only useful tool when the world stops behaving, I said, "I see an object that behaves like a person. It arrives. It leaves. It speaks." Father Arcadios's expression softened. "Good," he said. "Then you are not blind." That afternoon, as I walked in the courtyard, I noticed a man I hadn't seen before, not a monk, not a pilgrim. He wore modern clothes, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who is used to being allowed into restricted spaces. He watched me with an interest that felt practiced. When he approached, his English was fluent. "You are from California," he said. "Yes." "I am Andreas," he said, offering his hand. "I work with cultural restitution." The phrase sounded official enough to be real and vague enough to be weaponized. "We are concerned," he continued, about objects removed from Greece during certain periods. I held my expression neutral. I'm an archivist, I said. I'm here for research. Andreas smiled slightly. Research is often how removal begins, he said. The conversation stayed polite, but beneath it was a tension I recognized from institutional battles. Who has the right to claim an object? Who has the authority to decide its fate? Andreas leaned closer. There is a film, he said quietly, that has caused trouble for decades. I said nothing. He continued, it appears, it disappears. People have lost careers over it. Some have lost more than careers. Why? I asked. Andreas's smile faded. Because it contains, he said, evidence. Evidence of what? He looked away briefly as if weighing whether to say it. Then, evidence that certain histories were edited, he said. Not metaphorically, literally. My skin prickled. All histories are edited, I said. That's what narratives are. Andreas's gaze returned to me sharp. Not like this, he said. Before I could ask more, a bell rang, calling monks to prayer. Andreas stepped back. We will speak again, he said. Then he walked away, disappearing into corridors I didn't know. That evening, Father Arcadios told me, without me asking, do not speak to Andreas. Who is he? I asked. A man who believes ownership is righteousness, Arcadios said. He wants the real not to preserve it, but to use it. Use it how? I asked. Arcadios looked tired. To prove, he said. To accuse, to control. I thought of Sophia in Athens saying myths form when facts are dangerous. I thought of Mara filming the stone pillars of Meteora, trying to create a context that could hold what we were finding. I called Mara from a spot in the courtyard where reception existed like a reluctant miracle. I told her in careful fragments what I had seen, the room, the hanging film, the arc structure, Andreas. Mara was silent for a long moment, then she said, It's bigger. Yes, I said. What do you need from me? She asked. I looked at the darkening sky, at the monastery walls that had held secrets for centuries. I need you to find where the second reel is, I said. Mara's voice turned sharp with focus. Give me the clue again, she said. I repeated it. Home is where it is watched, the place the film calls itself. Mara exhaled. Okay, she said. Then we treat the film like it's speaking in edits. I almost smiled despite myself. What does that mean? It means, she said, we look for where the first reel ends. I froze, because she was right. The first reel, the one I watched 10 minutes of, had begun without titles, without context. But it had shown a room like the one I now stood near. It had shown monks handling film like ritual. If the first reel was a path, it might contain within it instructions, not written, filmed. And I'd only watched 10 minutes. I would need to watch again. But the reel was not mine to project, and the monastery did not permit spectacle. The story, like a film cut against my will, was building toward a confrontation between my desire to know and my responsibility not to destroy the very thing I sought. Reel 11, Viewing Conditions. The next morning, Father Arcadios surprised me. He brought the canister to the small room where I had first seen it. He set it on the table. You may watch, he said. My breath caught. You said, I said not to watch, he replied. And now I say watch. Why? I asked. He looked at me with a calm that felt like a practiced sorrow. Because the real will not remain here, he said. And you must know what you are bringing into the world. I stared at him. You're giving it to me. He didn't answer directly. He lifted the lid. Inside was the reel, wound on a core, just as it had been at UCLA. He placed it on a small projector I hadn't noticed before, older, maintained lovingly, its gate clean. This was not a modern screening room. It was a cell of controlled light. He turned off the overhead lights. Only a small lamp remained. The room became intimate, almost confessional. He looked at me. If you watch, he said, You accept responsibility for what you see. That phrase, responsibility for what you see, felt like the true ethic of both archives and cinema. To see is never neutral. I accept, I said, though I didn't know what I was agreeing to. Father Arcadios threaded the film with hands that moved like someone handling scripture. He did not rush. He did not fumble. He treated the reel as if it could feel impatience. The projector began. The screen lit. The cliff, the monastery, the drift of clouds. Again, the film's tonal range struck me. The way it held detail in both bright stone and shadow. The way it seemed to anticipate the limits of projection and then exceed them. The monk walking upward, the camera following, the corridor lined with icons. The chant, faint beneath mechanical flutter. Then the door opening into the room of hanging film. This time, I watched not as someone caught in spell, but as an archivist with a task. Find the edit, find the clue, find the hinge where meaning turns. I saw things I hadn't seen before. The way the film strips hanging from beams formed patterns, not random, but arranged like lines of text. The jars on the table labeled with symbols that looked briefly like catalogue numbers. A close-up of a hand placing a strip of film into a book, as if the film itself were being archived in paper. Then the monk's face turning to camera, his lips shaping my name. I felt the same bodily jolt, but now it came with a secondary shock. The monk's mouth formed not only my name, but a second word. Tomorrow, the film cut. We were no longer in the room. We were outside at night. A fire lit stone with flickering orange. Monks moved quickly, carrying objects, books, icons, film cans, out of a building. The camera moved among them like a participant, not an observer. It did not linger on faces for drama. It recorded actions with the blunt clarity of necessity. Then came a sequence that made my heart pound. Men in military uniforms entering the monastery grounds. Not modern soldiers, not medieval, something in between. Boots, rifles, helmets that suggested early to mid-20th century. The German occupation. The camera did not dramatize. It simply watched as soldiers searched, took, burned. One soldier held up a film canister and laughed. Another soldier looked at the camera. For a second, his gaze met mine across decades. And then, this is where the film became for me something beyond documentary. There was a shot of the soldier opening the canister, pulling out the film, and holding the strip up to the firelight. In that firelight, the film strip's frames were visible. And the frames, even at that distance, showed images I recognized. The UCLA vault, my bench, my hands on the rewinds. The soldier's face tightened. He dropped the strip as if it burned. The camera moved closer. The strip lay on stone. In the firelight, the frames flickered, not because the strip moved, but because the fire breathed. And within that breath, the image on the strip changed. It showed not my bench, but a room I had never seen. A modern screening room filled with people, their faces lit by projected light. At the front, on the screen, the monk's corridor. A film showing a film showing a film. I felt my stomach lurch. I glanced at Father Arcadios. His face was still, as if he had watched this many times and learned to carry it. On screen, the soldier stepped back. The monastery around him felt suddenly less like a place, and more like a set built to stage a theft. Then the film cut again. We were in a different place, a city street. Athens, perhaps, though uncaptioned. People moved, tense, hurried. A political rally, police. The soundtrack carried shouts, then a sudden sharp crack, gunfire. The camera fell as if the operator had been struck. The frame went sideways. For several seconds, the image showed only pavement, shoes running past, a fallen banner fluttering. Then, slowly, the camera was lifted again. A face filled the frame. An older man, eyes intense. Callistratos. I knew him not because I had seen him before, but because the film held his face as if introducing him to me specifically. He looked into the lens and his mouth moved. There was no synchronized sound for his words, but the optical track carried a low, steady tone, as if the film itself were resisting translation. Still, I understood what he said, not through hearing, but through the strange certainty of recognition. If you're seeing this, it is because you have become the custodian. The film continued. Callistratos carried a canister into a room, an office lined with books. He opened a drawer, placed the canister inside, and shut it. Then he turned to the camera and held up a second reel. He wrote on a paper tag, "Home." The projector's sound became louder in my ears. I realized I was holding my breath. On screen, Callistratos walked out of the office carrying the second reel. The camera followed him into a corridor. He stopped before a door. The door had a sign in English, and the sign read, UCLA Film and Television Archive. My hands went numb. The film, shot decades ago, showed Callistratos arriving at UCLA. Not a dramatization and not a reenactment, a record. He entered the archive, past shelves that looked eerily like my present shelves, and placed the second reel, not on a cart, not in intake, but into a specific location. A wall cavity behind shelving, accessed by removing a panel. He replaced the panel. He stepped back. Then he looked directly into the camera and smiled. Briefly, sadly, as if acknowledging the absurdity of trying to control the future. The film cut to black. The projector's fluttering continued. Then white text appeared, not as modern subtitles, but as something burned into the emulsion. The second reel is where you began. I heard myself exhale, ragged. Father Arcadios turned on the small lamp. He looked at me. "Now you know," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "The second reel is at your archive," he said. "Hidden by the man who removed it. Hidden so that you would find it when the time was correct." I swallowed. "Then why did the first reel appear at UCLA?" I asked. Father Arcadios's gaze was steady. "Because you needed to begin," he said. "Because the film needed to be watched to be found." Mara's earlier question returned with force. What if watching is part of how it moves? I stood, unsteady. "And Andreas?" I asked. Father Arcadios's face hardened slightly. "Andreas believes he can own the past," he said. "He will follow you." A chill moved through me, not from cold air, but from narrative inevitability. Of course there was pursuit. Of course the object that resisted custody would attract those who desired control. I looked at the canister, then at the projector, then at Father Arcadios. "What are you asking me to do?" I asked. He answered simply, "Return it," he said, "and then decide what to do with what it shows." Reel 12, return cut. Leaving Athos felt like leaving a dream that had weight. The permit process reversed. Names checked again. Boat back across indifferent sea. The modern world resumed with its noise and speed, its insistence that mysteries should become content. Mara met me in Thessaloniki. The moment she saw my face, she knew I had watched more than 10 minutes. We sat in a quiet cafe away from tourists. I told her what the film showed. The occupation, Callistratos, the UCLA sign, the hidden panel. Mara's eyes shone, not with triumph, but with the hunger of a filmmaker who has just been handed evidence that narrative structure itself might be embedded in reality. "The second reel is there," she said, almost to herself. "It's been there the whole time." "And the first reel is moving," I said. "It appears where it needs to appear." Mara leaned forward. "We need to document the retrieval," she said, "not for sensationalism, for accountability." "Accountability to whom?" I asked. Mara didn't hesitate. "To the future," she said. "To whatever comes after us, when people try to claim this is myth or hoax or propaganda." I wanted to agree. The archivist in me wanted chain of custody, documentation, metadata, redundancy. The scholar in me wanted citations. The human in me wanted to crawl into silence. But there was Andreas, and there was the film's warning about duplication. If copies came out blank, documentation would matter even more. Yet if the film resisted copying, perhaps documentation itself was part of its resistance. We flew back to Los Angeles with the canister in my carry-on, wrapped and protected, my nerves tight every time the bag shifted. I did not declare it as contraband because it wasn't. It was simply film. And yet, every time my hand touched the bag, I felt as if I were touching a live wire. At UCLA, we entered the archive early, before most staff arrived. I used my keycard. The door beeped. Institutional normality, fluorescent lights, the familiar hum, the world pretending it had never broken its rules. Mara set up her camera discreetly, aimed not at faces but at my hands, at the shelves, at the panel she would record me removing. We went to the aisle where the first reel had appeared. I stood before the shelves, heart hammering in a way that felt ridiculous. These were steel racks, barcodes, institutional order. And yet the film had shown a hidden cavity behind a panel. I ran my fingers along the shelf supports, feeling for inconsistency. There, a seam, a section that sat slightly differently. A panel that, if you didn't know to look, would read as structure. I found screws, old, slightly stripped, not part of standard shelving. My hands shook as I unscrewed them. Mara's camera recorded silent. The panel came loose. Behind it, darkness. And inside that darkness, a metal canister. The same dull patina, the same calm handwriting. Not the Lost Monastery, just one word, home. For a moment, I couldn't move. Then I reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than I expected, as if filled not only with film, but with years of waiting. Mara exhaled softly behind the camera. "We have it," she said. But I didn't feel victory. I felt the heavy, sober sensation of having completed a task written by someone else. I opened the canister. Inside was the second reel, wound on a core. Leader long, clean, and on the leader, taped paper with the warning, again in that same hand, "Do not duplicate, do not project." Then, below, written as if in response to my inevitable disobedience, "You will anyway." Mara lowered the camera slightly. "We need to decide where to watch," she said. I stared at the reel, feeling the archive around us, the racks of other films, other histories, other stored lives. The film had called this place home. Home is where it is watched. "So," Mara said gently, "we watch here." I looked up at the vault, at the shelves, at the controlled air, and I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The Lost Monastery was never only a monastery in Greece. It was also this archive. A place built to keep light in darkness. A place where the past waits on shelves until someone's eyes complete the circuit. We took the two reels, first and second, into a small screening room reserved for internal viewing. Not the Grand Theatre, not a public space. A room with a projector maintained for careful use. I called two colleagues I trusted, a conservator and a curator, people who understand that sometimes you are asked to witness something not because it is entertaining, but because it is ethically urgent. Mara asked if she should film the screening. I hesitated. Then I said, "Film us, not the screen." Because if the film resisted duplication, perhaps it would resist being filmed as image. But it might not resist being recorded as effect. We sat in the dark. The projector began. The first reel ran, carrying us through the monastery, the occupation, Callistratos, the hidden panel. Then it ended. The room held its breath. I threaded the second reel. My hands moved with professional steadiness, despite the tremor under my skin. The projector resumed. The screen lit. And the Lost Monastery became something else entirely. Reel 13, the second reel's face. If the first reel was a path, the second was a mirror. It began not with cliffs, but with a close-up of film emulsion under magnification, grain like a field of stars. Then the image pulled back, and I realized I was seeing a strip of film held up to light. Hands held it. The hands were mine, not symbolically, literally. My fingers, my nails, the small scar on my knuckle from a splicer accident years ago. The camera angle was impossible unless someone had filmed me from above at my inspection bench, but I had never been filmed at my bench until Mara started recording that morning. And Mara's camera was not projecting onto the screen. It was behind us. The film continued. It showed me in the vault, holding the canister labeled The Lost Monastery. It showed the power outage. It showed me placing the canister into the secure cabinet. It showed me the next day opening the cabinet to emptiness. It showed me calling Mara. I felt a cold sweat gather at my spine. The curator beside me whispered, "How?" I didn't answer because there was no answer that wouldn't sound like insanity. On screen, the story continued beyond what I had lived. It showed Mara and me in Greece. Athens, Thessaloniki, Meteora. Angles I recognized, but filmed from perspectives we had not recorded. It showed me on Athos speaking with Father Arcadios. Then it cut to scenes I had not experienced, a meeting in a sterile office with Andreas, who held a folder marked with government seals. His mouth moved, and this time the sound was clear. "We can't allow it," he said. "If people see this, the past becomes unstable." Then the film cut again. A room, modern, fluorescent, bureaucratic, a screen, people watching the film. The people were wearing badges and their faces were tense. I watched them watch me, a loop of surveillance, and I felt nauseated. The conservator leaned forward, whispering, "This is some kind of constructed metafilm, someone spliced in footage." But then the film went somewhere no splicing could explain. The screen showed the monastery room again, the hanging film strips, the jars, the arc structure. But now the camera moved closer than before, into the structure itself. Inside the arc was not a lens. It was a strip of film running through a gate illuminated by candlelight. And on that strip, this is where my brain threatened to break into disbelief. I saw images not from the past, but from eras that had no right to exist on film. A street in Athens in the 5th century, women in peplos, men with beards, the Acropolis not as ruin but as living architecture. The camera moved among them like a ghost. No one reacted to it, no one stared at the lens. It was as if the camera were not there. Then a monastery scriptorium in the 11th century, scribes copying text by lamplight, their hands steady, their mouths murmuring prayers. Then a battlefield in 1821, Greek fighters, Ottoman uniforms, smoke and shouting, the camera moving with a calm that felt almost cruel. Then, suddenly, a scene of Los Angeles that did not match any decade I knew. The UCLA campus, but altered. Buildings different, signage in languages I couldn't place, drones moving overhead like silent insects. The film archive building looked damaged, partially collapsed. People moved among the ruins carrying canisters, carrying hard drives, carrying objects with the desperation of salvage. A voice on the soundtrack spoke, clear in English, not a narrator, not a monk, not Callistratos, a woman's voice, Mara's voice, but older. "We thought archives were places," the voice said, "but they're actually agreements." On screen, the older Mara, if it was Mara, turned to camera. Her hair was grey, her face lined, her eyes still sharp. She held up a canister. On it was written, "The Lost Monastery." She spoke into the lens. "If you're watching this," she said, "it means you found it too early or too late. There is no right time. There is only the time you have." I felt my throat tighten. Mara beside me was frozen. The older Mara continued. "The film is not prophecy," she said. "It's a test. It shows you what your attention makes possible. It shows you what your negligence erases." The screen cut to another scene. My bench, but not in my present. Older equipment, different monitors. A young archivist I didn't recognize inspecting a strip of film. The young archivist looked up and looked directly at me, not at the camera. At me. I had the bizarre sensation of being seen through the screen, as if the projector were not projecting outward but opening a channel. The young archivist spoke. His words came through the soundtrack with a clarity that made the room feel suddenly too small. "Do you understand now?" he asked. The film cut to black. Then text appeared, burned into emulsion. "The unknown past is not unknown. It is uncatalogued." Then, "The unforeseen future is not unforeseen. It is unpreserved." I heard someone behind me inhale sharply. The projector's fluttering continued as if indifferent. Then the image returned, back to the monastery room, back to the arc structure. Father Arcadios stood before it, hands raised not in prayer, but in something like calibration. He spoke, and this time the sound was clear. "Cinema is not invention," he said. "It is recovery." He turned to camera and said my name again. Then he added, "You think you preserve film, but film preserves you." The reel ended. The projector lamp dimmed. The room went dark in the ordinary way films end. No supernatural flicker, no dramatic power outage. Just a machine finishing its labor. For several seconds, no one spoke. The conservator finally whispered, "This is impossible." Mara's voice was low, almost reverent. "It's also specific," she said. "Specificity is the enemy of hoax." I sat in the dark, feeling the weight of what I had just seen settle into my bones. The film had shown not only history, but a theory of history, that the past and future are not fixed entities waiting to be discovered, but sequences that depend on what is preserved and what is allowed to decay. It had shown an archive in ruins. It had shown Mara older, speaking from a time that might never happen. It had shown me not as a neutral custodian, but as a subject. And the most shocking implication, the one that did not announce itself with spectacle but with quiet inevitability, was this. The film was not merely in the archive. The film had made the archive part of its own structure. It had folded UCLA into Meteora. It had made my professional life a scene in its second reel. It had turned preservation into participation. Reel 14. What you do with a relic. The next day, I did not go to the vault first. I sat at my desk with both reels sealed, the canisters on the table like two heavy questions. Mara sat across from me, notebook open, her camera off for the first time since we began. "What do we do?" she asked. The question contained everything. Ethics, legality, scholarship, fear. In my training, the answer should have been clear. Accession the film properly, document chain of custody, consult legal counsel, involve leadership, coordinate with Greek institutions, and, crucially, avoid projecting original material unnecessarily, create a preservation scan, store in cold, provide access copies. But the film had said, "Do not duplicate," and Sophia had said, "Copies come out blank." If the film resisted duplication, then the usual archival solution, redundancy, failed. Redundancy is our religion. Multiple elements, multiple locations, multiple formats, because everything fails eventually, and your only defense is to be present in more than one place at once. A film that refused copying was a rebuke to our entire strategy. "Could we scan it?" Mara asked. "We can try," I said. "And if it scans blank?" "Then we still have the original," I said, then heard the fragility in my own words. Originals burn, originals warp, originals mold, originals are never forever. "And if it scans not blank," Mara pressed, "then the warning was a lie. Or, I thought, the warning was selective, a vow, not a law, a warning not against duplication as a process, but duplication as misuse." My phone buzzed with an email, then another, then another. The subject lines carried the same name, Andreas. He had found us. Of course he had. His first message was polite. "I understand you have located material relevant to Greek cultural heritage. We should meet." His second message was less polite. "The film is not yours to hold. There are legal consequences." His third message was quiet, almost intimate. "If you show it publicly, you will be responsible for what follows." I stared at the screen. Mara watched my face. "He's threatening," she said. "Or warning," I said. Mara's jaw tightened. "People always call threats warnings when they think they're righteous," she said. I stood. "We need institutional protection," I said. "And we need Greek partners, Sophia, Petros, Father Arkadios. And we need a plan for the film's meaning," Mara added. "Because if we dump it into public as spectacle, we become the thing the monks feared." She was right. If the film was a relic, it demanded not worship, but careful framing, context that prevents it from becoming a weapon. We began the work of scholars, assembling a coalition. I contacted Sophia in Athens, sent her documentation of the second reel's retrieval, offered partnership, and shared custody. Her reply came quickly, sharp and astonished. "You found it. Do not let them bury it." I contacted Petros in Thessaloniki, who wrote back, "Empty cans do not stay empty forever." I contacted Father Arkadios through Ioannis at Meteora. The message returned short. "Show it only to those who will bear it." And then I did something that felt like stepping into a moral spotlight. I informed UCLA leadership. I disclosed the film's existence, its uncertain provenance, and the fact that it might be claimed by Greek authorities. There were meetings, legal counsel, security protocols, discussions of cultural property. Words like liability and reputation entered the air like disinfectant. Through it all, Mara remained focused on one thing. How do we show without exploiting? Finally, we agreed on a plan that felt both cautious and radical. A controlled scholarly screening, small by invitation, co-hosted with Greek archival representatives, framed explicitly as an ethical and historical inquiry, not a publicity event. No recordings of the screen, no phones, no press, and an attempt, quiet, careful, to scan a short segment under controlled conditions, not for distribution but for preservation testing. We would treat the film not as content, but as a case study in what cinema can be when it is treated as more than entertainment. The day before the screening, the conservator and I set up a scanner in the lab. We cleaned the gate, calibrated, tested with known stock. We loaded 10 feet of leader from the second reel, not image, just leader, to see if the system would even read it. The scan came through, not blank. Ordinary leader grain. My heart pounded. Then cautiously we scanned a few frames of image. The monitor displayed nothing. Not black, not blank, not an error, a kind of shimmering grey like fog on glass. The scanner logs showed data. The file existed. It simply contained no readable image. We tried different settings, different exposure, different software. The result remained the same. Mara watched quietly, then said, "So the myth is fact?" "Yes," I said. "Then the only way to see it is to project it," she said. "And to lose it eventually," I whispered. I felt suddenly the full philosophical cruelty of the film's design. It demanded that seeing remain embodied, local, temporal. You could not stream it, you could not copy it, you could not make it safe by turning it into data. It forced cinema back into what it originally was, an event, a gathering in darkness, a shared vulnerability, a vow of attention. Reel 15. Screening. On the evening of the screening, the room held fewer than 20 people. 2 representatives from the Greek Film Archive, a historian of Byzantine monasticism, a cinematographer who specialized in photochemical processes, a philosopher of media, a UCLA administrator whose presence made everyone careful, the conservator, the curator, Mara, me. No one spoke loudly. The atmosphere felt less like a premiere and more like a deposition. I stood at the front and explained what we knew. Provenance, partial documentation, the warning, the failed scan. I did not claim certainty. I did not use sensational language. I spoke as I would in a scholarly conference, because scholarship is one of the few forms of speech that can hold awe without collapsing into melodrama. Then we turned off the lights. The projector began. The first reel ran, carrying everyone through the monastery, the occupation Callistratos, the hidden panel. I watched faces lit by flickering light. Even the skeptical ones had changed posture, the body's involuntary recognition that something unusual was happening. Then the second reel. When the film showed my hands, my scar, there were murmurs. When it showed Athens centuries ago, the historian leaned forward as if pulled. When the older Mara spoke, Mara beside me went so still she looked carved. And when the text appeared, the unknown past is not unknown. It is uncatalogued. I heard someone laugh softly, not in humor, but in the shock of being addressed. The film ended. The lights stayed off for several seconds longer than necessary. Finally, the curator turned on a small lamp. No one spoke. Then Sophia's representative, an older man with careful eyes, said quietly, "This is dangerous." The administrator straightened. "Because of cultural property claims?" she asked, already reaching for bureaucratic terrain. The man shook his head. "Because it makes archives political in a way you cannot avoid," he said. "It shows that what you preserve becomes what history is allowed to be." The philosopher spoke next. "It collapses the boundary between record and creation," she said. "If the film includes its own chain of custody, then history is not merely documented, it is performed." Mara finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. It's telling us, she said, that the future isn't something we wait for. It's something we either prepare a record for or we leave nothing but silence. I sat, hands clasped, feeling both exposed and oddly calm. Because the shock, the true shock, was not the film's impossible images. The shock was the mirror it held up to my profession. All my life I had believed that preservation was a kind of humility, serving the past by keeping it intact for others. But the Lost Monastery suggested something sharper. Preservation is authorship. What we decide to store, to restore, to make accessible. These decisions sculpt what future people will believe about who we were. Archives are not museums of what happened. They are engines of what will be thinkable. The unknown past is not unknown. It is uncatalogued. And uncatalogued things, if not found, do not simply remain hidden. They become non-existent. That night, after everyone left, Mara and I stayed behind in the empty screening room. The projector cooled, ticking softly like an animal settling. Mara looked at me. "Do you feel like you've been recruited?" she asked. The word landed hard. "Yes," I said. "By monks?" she asked. "By Callistratos? By the film?" I thought of Father Arcadios saying the film preserves you. I thought of my own hands on screen. "I feel," I said slowly, "like I've been edited into something I didn't audition for." Mara smiled faintly, then sobered. "So what now?" she asked. I looked at the two canisters on the table. Now came the final ethical choice, the one the film had been pushing toward all along. Do we keep it hidden, protecting it from misuse but ensuring it remains a private relic? Or do we acknowledge that its meaning, its warning, demands a broader audience, even if broader audience means greater risk? In archives, we often pretend that withholding is neutrality. It isn't. Withholding is also authorship. I took a breath. "We do what archivists are supposed to do," I said. Mara raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "We make it findable," I said. "We catalogue it honestly. We document its provenance honestly. We keep it secure. We create viewing conditions that respect its limits." "And the public?" Mara asked. I thought of tourists eating ice cream at Meteora. I thought of Andreas wanting to weaponize. I thought of the older Mara in ruins. "The public," I said, "gets it in the only way it can be given." Mara waited. "As an event," I said. "Not as a file, not as content, as a gathering, a ritual of attention." Mara nodded slowly. "A monastery," she said. "Yes," I said. "A monastery made of chairs and darkness and a projector lamp." Reel 16. Coda or the archive as vow. We accessioned the film. We wrote the catalogue entry with language that admitted uncertainty without surrendering to vagueness. We recorded its known chain: Athens ledger, Callistratos correspondence, UCLA cavity, Athos custody. We attached scans of letters, photographs of the canisters, witness statements from the screening. We placed it in cold storage under strict access. We built a protocol. Who could request a viewing, under what conditions, with what safeguards. We included Greek partners in every step. And still, despite every act of institutional discipline, I knew, in a way I could not prove, that the film would do what it wanted. Because it had already demonstrated that custody is not only physical, custody is narrative. Custody is attention. Sometimes late at night I remember the first 10 minutes, the way my mind stopped monitoring damage and began to surrender to image. I remember the monk's corridor, the icons watching, the room of hanging film. I remember how easily I forgot my professional posture and became simply a human being watching light move. Cinema, at its best, does that. It takes the mind out of its administrative habits and makes it porous. But the Lost Monastery went further. It insisted that porosity is not passive, that watching is not consumption, that watching is participation in how time will be remembered. In my office now, I keep a photograph Mara took, my hands unscrewing the hidden panel, the moment before the canister labeled Home emerged. The photo isn't mystical. It's grainy, documentary, honest. It reminds me that mysteries, when they are real, often appear as carpentry. Sometimes I think of Callistratos, his smile into the camera, his sad acknowledgement that he was shaping a future he would never see. I think of Father Arcadios, guarding a room where film hung like prayer. I think of Sophia in Athens, tired and fierce, refusing to let disappearance become destiny. And I think of the film's most unsettling proposition, that the past and future are not fixed reels on a shelf, but strips that can be damaged, cut, hidden, burned, rescued, rethreaded. That history is not only what happened, history is what survives viewing. The final implication, the one that still wakes me sometimes, arrived not as an image, but as a professional realization. If the film cannot be duplicated, then its survival depends on bodies gathering in darkness to watch it. It depends on the continuation of an old technology that the world keeps trying to declare obsolete. It depends on the willingness to be present, and maybe that is the vow embedded in emulsion. Not prophecy, not a curse. A vow that says you don't get to outsource memory. You have to show up for it. You have to sit in the dark with strangers and let light strike your eyes and risk being changed by it. That is what monks have always known. That is what archivists sometimes forget. When the vault is quiet and the shelves hold their cold, patient promise, I sometimes imagine the archive not as a warehouse but as a monastery, an architecture built to protect attention from the world's constant hunger to consume without remembering. And on certain evenings when we host another controlled screening, another gathering, another event, I watch the faces in the dark, and I see something that looks almost like devotion, not to the film as object, but to the act of preserving what it means to look carefully, to hold the unknown past gently enough that it can become known, to hold the unforeseen future responsibly enough that it can become livable. And I understand at last why the canister found me in the stacks and why it refused to stay. Because it was never only a film to be preserved, it was a question to be carried. And once you pick it up, you have already begun. Write a compelling teaser to this story. Thought for 1 minute, 23 seconds. Write a compelling teaser to this story. The Lost Monastery, a cinematic mystery of film, memory, and the dangerous ethics of preservation. At UCLA's Film Archive, where history sleeps in climate-controlled silence, I found a reel that should not have existed. It had no accession number, no record, only a handwritten title on its rusted canister. The Lost Monastery. I watched 10 minutes before a power outage cut the image to black. When I returned the next day, the film was gone, erased not just from the shelves, but from the archive's memory itself. What began as a professional anomaly became an obsession that crossed continents. With a documentary filmmaker at my side, I followed the film's ghost trail from Los Angeles to Athens, from forgotten ledges to cliff-top monasteries where cinema had been treated not as entertainment, but as ritual. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This film was not merely recorded, it remembered. It moved when watched, it hid when pursued, and it seemed to know me. In Greece, I discovered the truth that archivists are trained never to admit. Preservation is not neutral. Every archive edits the past. Every act of saving is also an act of authorship, and some images, if copied or exposed too widely, do not survive at all. When the film finally revealed its second reel, its implications were staggering, suggesting a past that had been deliberately erased, a future shaped by what we choose to preserve, and a terrifying possibility that cinema is not a mirror of history but one of its architects. The Lost Monastery is a philosophical thriller disguised as a film archive mystery, where celluloid becomes prophecy, monasteries become editing rooms, and the simple act of watching carries consequences. It asks an unsettling question that lingers long after the screen goes dark. What if the future is not waiting to be predicted, but already watching us decide what to remember? 5 good titles and subtitles. Here are 5 strong title plus subtitle pairings, each emphasizing a slightly different facet of the story: scholarly, cinematic, philosophical, and mysterious. The Lost Monastery, a film archive mystery about memory, time, and the danger of watching too closely. Archive of Light, how a missing film exposed the secret history hidden inside cinema. The second reel, a scholar's pursuit of a film that refused to be preserved. Custodians of the Unseen, a cinematic investigation into the ethics of preservation and the shape of history. When Film Remembers You. A philosophical thriller set between monasteries, archives, and the unstable past. If you'd like, I can also push these more literary, more academic, or more commercial. Create series-style titles, for example, Codex Chronicles, Archive Mysteries. Match titles explicitly to publisher expectations, NYRB/Greywolf/Academic Press/Audiobook First Branding. Write story teaser. I work in a cold vault where history is measured in shrinkage, vinegar, and the soft whisper of film through rewinds. Most days, my job is simple. Keep the dead safe from decay. Then I find a 35mm canister in the wrong aisle. No accession number, no donor file, no paper trail. Just a title written in calm, precise handwriting. The Lost Monastery. Inside, a warning taped to the leader. Do not duplicate. Do not project. If you are reading this, you have already begun. I break protocol, telling myself it's only an inspection, only identification. 10 minutes into the images, I'm no longer watching a film. I'm being drawn into it. A cliffside monastery, a corridor of icons that seem to track the lens, monks handling strips of film like relics, a room where cinema is treated not as entertainment, but as oath. Then the power goes out. The next morning, the canister is gone. No log entry, no transfer slip, no footage of anyone removing it. It's as if the archive itself has rejected the object. And if I can't prove it existed, I'm left with the most professionally humiliating possibility. A hallucination disguised as scholarship. So I call the only person I trust to treat the impossible like evidence, Mara, my longtime friend and documentary filmmaker, and we begin the work archives aren't built for, chasing a film that won't stay catalogued. Our search leads from UCLA's hidden paper files to Athens ledgers stamped during the junta years, to an empty canister held like a placeholder in Thessaloniki, to Meteora, stone pillars crowned with monasteries where access once depended on rope ladders and nerve. Each stop adds a new layer of dread. The film isn't simply missing, it has been moved, guarded, argued over, and mythologized. And then comes the final turn, the one that changes the nature of the hunt. Because Greece is not where the mystery ends. It's where the film begins to reveal what it actually is. Not a lost work, not a forbidden documentary, not a collector's prize, but an archive that remembers its viewers. When I finally recover the reels and project them under strict conditions, what unfolds on the screen is not just history, it is history watching back, collapsing the distance between record and prophecy, between preservation and complicity, between what we think we know and what was never allowed to be seen. And by the time the light fades, I'm left with one terrifying certainty. I didn't find the lost monastery, it found me.